The station master's name was Alderton, and he had the look of a man who had rehearsed what he needed to say and found no version of it that sat easy. She stepped down from the CPR car at 2:30 on a Wednesday. In late September, the platform at Crestwood Junction still wet from the morning's rain, and Alderton was already moving toward her before her trunk came off the baggage car. That told her something. "Miss Rourke," he said, though the way he said it made clear he already knew she was. "Yes," she said. He held his hat in both hands and did not put it back on. He told her about Hamish Price and the way people tell bad news at train stations. Short sentences, standing very still, eyes that found her forehead instead of her face. Hamish had been dead 11 days. Fever. The doctor in town had done what he could. Alderton said he was sorry for her trouble, which was a peculiar thing to say to the woman who had packed a trunk in Hamilton and ridden 4 days on the CPR to marry a man who was now in the ground. She thanked him. She did not know what else to do with her hands, so she left them at her sides. The platform was otherwise empty. 2 men from the grain elevator watched from a distance without pretending not to. The September sky pressed down flat and gray over the prairie, and the wind off the open fields carried the smell of turned earth and coming cold. And she stood with the letter Alderton had kept for her, folded in her coat pocket, and understood that she had arrived at a place where nothing was prepared for her at all. Alderton told her the hotel had 2 rooms, one of which was taken through November by a surveyor. He told her the next eastbound train was 12 days out. He said this last part with the expression of a man delivering a second piece of bad news before the first had settled, which was accurate. She asked if there was work in town. He considered that longer than she liked. "There's the laundry on the east side of Maine. Margaret Gowan runs it, but she's full through to November herself." He paused. "There's a man with a homestead 6 miles north. He knew Price. He was at the service." She waited. "He's not." Alderton started. Then he stopped and began again. He mentioned after the funeral that if you came and there was difficulty, he'd offer something reasonable. What sort of reasonable? "Work for the room," I think was what he said, "through harvest." She stood there on the wet platform and looked at the word reasonable, the way she'd been taught to look at any word that could mean several things at once. The prairie beyond the rail stretched north until it lost itself in the gray sky, and somewhere out in that direction was a homestead and a man she had never met. She asked for his name. Alderton gave it to her. He came into town the next morning with a wagon that had seen considerable weather and a gray mare that did not look at her when she approached. He himself looked at her directly, which she noted. He had the hands of a man who worked without gloves more often than was advisable, and a mouth that did not move much when he wasn't speaking. "Thank you for coming," she said. He said he'd brought the wagon for her trunk. That was the whole of the conversation until they were a mile out of town. She did not fill the silence. She had never been a woman who filled silence for its own sake, and so she watched the prairie instead. The yellow-gray of the October grass, the line of poplars along a creek she couldn't yet see, the way the sky sat on the land without any hills to interrupt it. She had spent her whole life in a city where the horizon was always someone else's roofline. This was something else entirely. She was still deciding what to make of it when he spoke. "The room is off the kitchen," he said. "Was meant to be a pantry. There's a window." "All right. I'll put a latch on the door today." She looked at the side of his face when he said it, his jaw set in the manner of a man stating a practical fact rather than making a promise. She understood the difference, and she understood that in this case, the practical fact was the promise. "All right," she said again. They rode the rest of the way in a quiet that was not, she found, uncomfortable, which was the first thing she noted about him. The homestead was neither better nor worse than she'd pictured. It was simply what it was, a plank-sided house with 2 rooms above a root cellar, a barn that listed slightly east, a kitchen garden gone to frost 2 weeks back, and a yard where the grass had been worn to bare earth by the passage of a man living alone for some time. The roof was sound. She checked that first, standing in the yard. She looked for the things that would matter through a Canadian winter, and found most of them present. The pantry room was small, The window faced east and would have morning light. A cot sat against the wall, recently placed. The wooden feet had not yet worn into the floor. And there were 2 nails on the back of the door, both empty. She put her coat on the first one. He left her to unpack and did not come back to that end of the house until she opened the door herself. They looked at each other across the kitchen. "Supper," he said, which she took for a question. "I'll do it," she said. He went back outside. She opened the larder and took stock: salt pork, dried beans, a turnip that needed using, potatoes going soft but still good at the center. She set water on the stove and began, and by the time the light had shifted from gray to amber across the floor, there was something in the pot, and the kitchen smelled like a kitchen ought to. He came in, hung his coat, washed his hands at the basin, and sat. She set the bowl in front of him and sat across. They ate without conversation, and that was fine. After, he said, "You didn't have to. You drove 6 miles in a wagon for my trunk," she said. "It seemed fair." He thought about that for a moment. Then he cleared the table himself, which she had not expected, and she filed it away the way she filed most things, carefully, without comment. The first week passed, as first weeks in unfamiliar houses always do. She learned where the flour was kept and where the axe lived, and which floorboard by the door would not stop creaking regardless of what you did about it. She learned he was up before light and in from the barn by 7, that he drank his coffee standing at the window before he sat down, and that he did not speak much in the mornings but somewhat more in the evenings, though more was still not much. She was careful, not out of fear, but because she understood the precise difference between charity and debt, and she meant for this arrangement to feel like neither. She found a split in the porch steps on the 3rd day, and mentioned it once, in the manner of information rather than request. He fixed it that afternoon. She did not thank him directly. She made biscuits the next morning instead of porridge the first time, and set one on top of his coffee cup the way she'd seen her mother do for her father on ordinary mornings in an ordinary house a long time before any of this. He looked at the biscuit. He looked at the cup. He drank his coffee. That was that. Mrs. Gowan came on a Friday with a covered dish, and what she likely believed was a subtle purpose. She was a compact woman with good boots and direct eyes, and she assessed the kitchen in the way women assess kitchens, looking for what it would tell her, and then she assessed the woman standing in it. "Settling in all right?" Mrs. Gowan said. "Well enough," she said. Mrs. Gowan stayed for tea, and mentioned 3 times in different phrasings that there was a boarding house in Crestwood Junction run by a widow with a spare room, that it was clean and the widow was respectable, and that it might suit her better than being 6 miles from town, and the only other person on the property being a man she hadn't known 3 weeks ago. She said it without judgment, but she said it all 3 times. She listened to all 3 versions and poured more tea. When Mrs. Gowan's wagon had gone down the road, she stood at the kitchen window and thought about the boarding house. The widow's room, probably clean, probably small, a window that faced wherever the widow had decided it should face. Then she thought about the east window she had now, and the way the light came through it at 6:30 and lay across the foot of the cot in a long pale rectangle that moved toward the door as the morning went on. She turned from the window and went back to the bread she had been making. Harvest came at the end of the week, and with it a cold that arrived overnight and did not leave. She had not been on a homestead in harvest before, and she learned it the way she had always learned difficult things, by watching once and then doing. The days ran from before first light to well past dark. The meals had to be ready when the work stopped, and not a minute after. There was nothing left in the evenings for anything beyond the fire and then sleep. She did not find it hard, she found it clarifying. There was a hired man through the worst of it. A young man named Sully, broad through the shoulders and quiet at the table, who ate 3 times what any reasonable person should, and did not attempt conversation during meals which she respected. She cooked for 3 instead of 2, and kept the stove running and carried water, and did the work that fell to whoever was in the house, without asking what her role was supposed to be. She looked at what needed to happen and made it happen. If this surprised him, he did not say so. On the fourth day, she found a split seam in his work coat hanging by the door. She took it down without asking, found a needle and the right weight of thread from her own kit, and had it back on the peg before he came in at noon. She watched him put it on and go back out, and she noticed the moment the repair registered. The brief pause in the motion of shrugging it on, a stillness that lasted just under a second. He did not say anything about it. She did not need him to. Sully left when the harvest finished, and the house returned to two people, which felt different now than it had at the beginning. She couldn't have said exactly what was different. The rooms were the same. The meals were the same. But the silences between them had changed character. Quieter in a different way, the way a room goes quiet when it belongs to someone rather than no one. She had 11 days before the eastbound train. She knew this because she had counted them. At first without meaning to, and then deliberately, the way a person counts something when they haven't decided yet whether they want the number to be large or small. The real cold came in the second week of October. The Canadian kind, the kind that arrived with intention. Frost on the inside of the windows by morning, ice on the water bucket before she'd had her coffee, the land outside going pale and still as though pressed flat under an enormous and indifferent hand. She brought in wood without being asked and stacked it where it ought to go. She found a gap in the caulking around the north kitchen window and filled it with a strip of rag, and then a second strip when the first wasn't sufficient. He came in from the barn and saw the rag and looked at it for a moment. "I'll do it properly before the hard freeze," he said. "This will hold until then," she said, which was accurate and not a concession. He poured his coffee without sitting down, the way he did when he was turning something over. She went on with what she was doing, which was sorting dried beans, and they were in the same kitchen with 3 feet of floor between them, and neither of them said the thing neither of them was saying, and the stove did its small steady work. That night he set a second lamp on the kitchen table without explaining why. The light was better for the mending she'd been doing in the evenings, and she had mentioned it once 3 days before. In passing, in the way she mentioned things she didn't genuinely expect to be acted upon. She looked at the lamp. Then she looked at him across the table, reading something she hadn't asked about and didn't ask about now. Then she went back to the mending. She had not spoken about Hamish Price, and he had not asked. This was, she had decided, one of the more decent things about him. He understood that a question could be a burden wearing the costume of consideration. She had not loved Hamish. She had been honest with herself about this since Hamilton, since before she had boarded the CPR West, since she had packed the trunk and said goodbye to the 2 rooms above the tailor's shop on Barton Street. She had agreed to the arrangement because she was 28 and the tailor had died and the rooms were being let to someone else, and she was practical rather than hopeful, and practical had seemed sufficient. Practical had been wrong in exactly the manner her aunt had warned her it would be. She had not told her aunt this because her aunt did not require the satisfaction. What she had not anticipated was this. A man who repaired the step she'd mentioned once, who put a lamp where the light was needed, who came in from the barn half frozen and did not remark upon the cold, who cleared his own dishes and had not once in 5 weeks asked her to account for herself, or explain her presence, or be anything other than what she was. She thought about this on the 8th night, lying on the cot with the east window dark and the frost making small sounds against the glass. She thought about it straight on, the way she'd learned to think about things that had no clean resolution, without flinching, without pretending she was thinking about something else. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep. The night before the train was due, she made supper without measuring anything, working by feel the way she did in this kitchen now, which she knew better than the one in Hamilton. She put the good plates down, the ones she'd found on the high shelf wrapped in cloth, the ones she'd wanted to use for a month and hadn't found occasion for. There was no occasion tonight either. She put them down anyway. He came in and looked at the plates. "Someone's birthday?" he said. "No," she said, and went back to the stove. They ate. He had bought a jar of Mrs. Gowan's dark plum preserves at the last delivery, and she had opened it without asking, and they had it on bread, and it was very good, and the lamp made the kitchen feel smaller and warmer than the actual dimensions warranted. After, she washed the plates while he sat with his coffee, and she could feel him not saying something the way you can feel weather, a change in the quality of the stillness, a particular density of air. She dried the plates and returned them to the high shelf, wrapped in the cloth, exactly as she'd found them. "Trains tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. She stood with her hands on the edge of the shelf and did not turn around for a moment. She thought about what packed looked like. The trunk out from under the cot, the east window without any morning coming through it, the peg with only his coat on it. Then she turned around. He was looking at his coffee cup. He was not a man who looked away to avoid a thing. He was a man who looked at what he could reasonably look at, and right now the cup was what he could reasonably look at. "The gap in the north window," she said. "If you mean to do it properly before the hard freeze, it should have been done last week." He looked up. "The hard freeze came 3 days ago," she said. "You'll need to redo what I put there with something that will actually hold. If you do it wrong, you'll pay for it all winter in heat you can't afford to lose." He was very still. "I know how to do it correctly," she said. "My father built in Ontario. I watched him do every window in the house the winter I was 12. He showed me twice so I'd remember." Something moved across his face that she didn't try to name. He set the cup down. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are deciding whether to trust. Not suspiciously, but carefully, giving the decision the weight it deserved. "All right," he said. She went to her room. She lay on the cot. The frost made its small sounds on the glass. And somewhere past the barn a coyote called twice into the dark and then went quiet. And she lay in the breathing stillness of the house, the tick of the stove cooling, the settle of the floorboard near the door, the particular sound a place makes when it has stopped being temporary without anyone formally announcing it. And she did not sleep for a long time. When she did not dream. In the morning, she did not pack. She was already at the stove. When he came in from the barn, her sleeves pushed to the elbows, the porridge on. She did not look up when the door opened. He did not say anything about the train. He washed his hands. He sat down. She set the bowl in front of him and sat across, and they ate in the quiet that had become their particular quiet, the kind that doesn't ask to be filled. After, she said, "You'll want proper caulking compound from the hardware in town. Oakum if Alderton's store carries it, cotton packing if not, and linseed oil to set it." "I know what to use," he said. "Good," she said. "I'll do the inside of the frame while you work the outside. It'll go faster with 2. He looked at her across the table, and she looked back at him, and she did not look away because she was not in the habit of looking away from things she had already decided. They both understood, without saying it, that they were not discussing caulking. "I'll go into town this morning then," he said. "I'll have dinner ready when you're back," she said. He put on his coat and went out. She heard the wagon wheels on the frozen ground turning toward the road, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched until the gray mare disappeared around the line of poplars, and then she turned back to the room, the stove, the shelf, with the good plates put away again in their cloth, the peg with his coat gone, and her coat still hanging. And she felt something settle in her, the way ground settles after it has frozen properly, solid all the way down, not going anywhere. She rolled up her sleeves and went to work. By the time the wagon came back up the road in the early afternoon, she had cleaned the pantry room to the boards, moved the cot to the better wall, stripped the east window of the things that had gathered on its sill. She had also moved her coat from its nail to the peg on the left side of the door, leaving the right peg, which had always been his, exactly where it had always been. He came in with the caulking and set it on the table and stood for a moment, looking at the kitchen, at the door, at the arrangement of coats on the pegs. She was at the window with the rag already out, waiting. He did not say anything about the coats. He took off his jacket and hung it on the right peg and came across the kitchen, and she stepped back from the window to give him room, and they got to work. Her from inside the frame and him from outside, passing things back and forth through the gap between them. The knife, the compound, the cotton strip, their breath showing faintly in the cold where the window had not yet been sealed. When the last section was done, she latched the window from inside. He latched it from outside. For one moment, there was only the glass between them and the width of a pane of cold air. And they were both on the same side of a decision that had not been spoken aloud because it had not needed to be. He came around to the door. She heard his boots on the porch boards, the boards that didn't creak on the second step anymore because he had fixed them when she'd mentioned it once, weeks ago now. The door opened. He came back into the house. She put the kettle on. Outside, the prairie held its gray October patience, and the smoke from the chimney went straight up into still air that had run out of wind for the day. And inside, the kitchen was warmer than it had been all week, with not a gap left anywhere for the cold to find its way in.